Tell me, what time is it where you are right now? And where in the world are you listening from? Let me know in the comments. I read every one, and if you find comfort in slow, quiet history, stories of betrayal, power, and forgotten details, told gently, without drama, make sure to subscribe. It helps more than you know. Now, let's begin. Asterisk, before a knife was drawn, or a whisper passed beneath a marble column, before Brutus even glanced sideways at Caesar, before history turned its gaze to blood and betrayal, there was paperwork. The Roman Republic did not run on charisma. It ran on forms, scrolls, and ink-stained fingers. And Julius Caesar, by the year 44 BCE, sat atop this world of dusty bureaucracy, buried under the very thing he once bypassed with military brilliance. The administration of the Roman state. Caesar was, in the final months of his life, not a man of war, but a man of lists. He had returned from campaigns not as a general seeking rest, but as a ruler in need of order. As dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, Caesar had accumulated not only supreme power, but supreme responsibility. There were roads to be repaired, colonies to be resettled, senators to be pardoned, land to be distributed. And somewhere in the shuffle of civic documents, retirement papers for Pompey's old men still sat unsigned. Each day, round sunrise, Caesar's routine began not with strategy or speeches, but with scrolls. They were brought to him in stacks, long curling documents, smudged with wax seals, and penned in countless hands, petitions, proposals, census reports, decrees awaiting his ratification. Many of them bore the scratches of slaves who transcribed orders from illiterate officials. Others carried notations from lower magistrates who had, in effect, passed the decision upward to the man they now privately resented. The office where he worked, a study near the Forum, was modest in size but heavy with symbols, smelled faintly of beeswax and old papyrus. A bust of Cato stood beside a cracked bronze map of Italy, and just behind his desk, 3 pigeon feather quills lay ready beside pots of ink, one of them always half dry. Caesar rarely wrote more than a signature himself. He dictated, slowly, deliberately, often repeating phrases twice, once for clarity, once for emphasis, and that's what made it boring. Not the lack of danger, but the complete and suffocating control. There were no debates anymore. The Senate sent him minutes, not arguments. The plebeians saw in him a living god, not a flawed man. And even the tribunes, once champions of the people, now waited for direction in one of these daily routines. As February gave way to early March, something shifted, not dramatically, not with violence or confrontation, but with absence. A certain senator stopped sending scrolls, one whose loyalty had once been public, then another. One of Caesar's aides noted that fewer annotations were arriving with the usual reports. The minutes from the Senate meetings had grown more curt, and when Caesar commented aloud that a routine grain shipment request had arrived unsigned, no one in the room answered. It would have been nothing in any other time. Rome had always been a place of delay. But this was Caesar's Rome, and in Caesar's Rome, delays meant resistance. Still, Caesar pressed forward. He scheduled reforms, reviewed decrees, approved city repairs in Gaul and housing developments in Spain. He began drafting new laws for the next calendar year, laws that would never see the Forum floor. He even approved an updated schedule for the upcoming festival of Anna Perenna, a celebration held mid-March that involved drinking wine, singing songs, and making wishes at the banks of the Tiber. By the first week of March, Caesar had already penciled in 3 public appearances. He had a Senate session to attend, a series of land decrees to announce, and a temple dedication to oversee. Everything was written in the margins of his official planner, a soft leather folio carried by one of his FREEDMEN, and still more silence. The absences weren't just from scrolls now. Senators who once greeted him in the streets began passing by with nods instead of words. A few skipped meetings altogether, citing illness or family obligations. One man, a minor magistrate, claimed his roof had collapsed. Caesar, ever the strategist, took note not of the roof, but of the pattern behind closed doors, began asking simple questions. How many senators were present today? Did anyone comment on the grain proposal? Where is Decimus? Decimus Junius Brutus, a trusted officer and friend, not to be confused with Marcus Brutus, had once fought alongside Caesar in Gaul. Lately, he had taken to skipping morning meetings, and Marcus Brutus himself, always formal and polite, had become unusually vague when pressed for answers. And yet Caesar, perhaps out of confidence or out of habit, chose not to act. He had survived worse. He had crossed the Rubicon. He had crushed Pompey. He had stood in Alexandria as victor and returned to Rome under banners of laurel and gold. To believe betrayal was coming would require believing the Senate had teeth again. Instead, he did what any busy administrator would do. He scheduled the next meeting. He sent out notices, official ones, stamped with his seal, requesting the full presence of the Senate. On the 15th of March, he signed them himself, carefully, one by one. The last thing he did that night, according to his staff, was draft a brief speech. It's not a long one, only a few lines to open the session. It spoke of unity, of Roman greatness, of the need for shared vision and continued reform. He underlined the word continued. The scroll was tucked into his planner, and on the final line of that speech, he left a small mark, a tiny slash of ink that looked like a dot, perhaps a blotch, or perhaps a pause. History does not tell us why, but it was the last time Julius Caesar ever prepared remarks for the Senate, and the last time the Senate ever received an invitation that wasn't soaked in blood. Asterisk, the morning of the 15th of March, 44 BCE, was overcast not with storm clouds, but with something duller. A haze of city dust floated above Rome's streets, stirred by cartwheels and sandal steps, settling on rooftops and colonnades. The Tiber flowed sluggishly, reflecting a dull gray sky that promised neither rain nor sun. It was a day that passed, without weather, the kind of Roman morning where time moved in silence, broken only by the creak of doors and the slap of damp cloth against stone. In Caesar's house on the Palatine Hill, the air was heavier than usual. His wife, Calpurnia, had not slept well. It is said, by those who recorded such things, that she awoke from troubled dreams, her breath tight, her voice low and urgent. She pleaded with Caesar not to go to the Senate that day, not because of politics, not because of omens, but because she had dreamt of blood. This wasn't unusual for the time. Romans, especially the elite, lived by signs and portents, entrails, birds, dreams, stars, but Caesar, while not without superstition, had little patience for dramatic warnings. He listened respectfully as Calpurnia recounted the dream, a statue of him bleeding from 100 wounds. He placed a hand on hers. He promised to consider it. He even delayed dressing. For a brief hour, Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, dictator of Rome, considered staying home, not out of fear, but fatigue. The last weeks had worn him down. The endless scrolls, unreadable silences, the sense of something just beyond his reach. And yet, even as he hesitated, the Senate waited. Or rather, they pretended to. A group of senators had gathered earlier than usual at the theater of Pompey. Not a theater in the modern sense, but a vast public complex with colonnades, gardens, meeting halls, and, crucially, curia, where the Senate occasionally convened. The curia of Pompey was meant to be a temporary location while renovations continued on the older Senate house in the Forum. It was an odd place for statecraft. In the center of Roman politics stood a space originally built for plays and performances. and now it held the final act of a dictator's life. Inside the curia, the senators moved carefully. They spoke in half phrases. Some paced, others leaned against marble walls, pretending to review legislation. A few sat quietly, hands resting in their laps, staring at nothing. The silence wasn't rehearsed, but it was shared. One of the conspirators, Julius Caesar, checked the time repeatedly. Decimus Brutus arrived late, but calm. He had, only hours before, gone to Caesar's house to gently persuade him to attend the session, despite Calpurnia's pleas. He framed it as a matter of reputation that Caesar, if seen yielding to superstition, would invite ridicule. He did not raise his voice. He did not mention knives, and Caesar, tired and flattered, had agreed. By the time the dictator finally left his home, carried in a litter by slaves through the winding Roman streets, the city had already begun to breathe. Bakers stacked flat loaves near steaming ovens. Vendors pushed carts over cobbles, calling out dates in vinegar and salted almonds. Temple bells rang faintly from the Aventine. A senator or two walked in the opposite direction of Caesar's path. Their faces turned to alleys. The streets narrowed as the procession neared the theater of Pompey. A few passers-by paused to watch. There was no escort, no legionaries, only a handful of attendants and aides, and the quiet tread of sandals on ancient stone. The theater complex loomed ahead, massive, angular, partly shadowed by its own colonnades. The entrance was quiet, too quiet. Caesar dismounted from the litter, slowly, pressing his hands to his knees. His body, long worn by war and marching, moved with stiffness now. He turned to one of his aides and handed over a scrawl of the speech he'd drafted days before. Aide tucked it under his arm. They walked together through the archway and into history. Inside the curia, the senator stood as he entered. The air shifted. It was the kind of stillness that only descends when too many people know too much. Caesar smiled politely. He moved to the front of the hall. The curved benches were already filled. The stone beneath his sandals echoed slightly. He looked down once at the floor, adjusted the folds of his toga, and stepped toward the central platform, where the chair awaited him. Behind him, the senators moved in. The room was not locked. The doors were not barred. The guards were not summoned. The conspirators, more than 60 by some accounts, had not rehearsed the moment together. But they had rehearsed it individually. Each knew where he was to stand, who would move first, who would speak the opening line. It would begin not with a blow, but with a petition. They would approach him as men seeking favor, a request to recall an exile, perhaps, or a gesture to demonstrate humility and fealty. The first man would kneel, then another, then Casca drew the first blade, but not yet. In that moment, as Caesar adjusted his seat, cleared his throat, and opened the scroll for the speech he no longer needed to give, he was still a man of paperwork, still a man of lists, of procedures, of reforms not yet finished. It was, for one final breath, still morning, still dust in the air, still silence on the stone, still Rome, waiting. And somewhere inside that moment, as Brutus approached, Decimus looked away. His hand reached beneath a folded robe. The last sentence Caesar ever wrote remained unread. Was it a mistake? To ignore Calpurnia's dream? Was it pride or trust that led him here? Or had he simply come because that's what he always did? In the split between breath and blade, Rome forgot how to blink. Julius Caesar, dictator perpetuo, conqueror of Gaul, man of paperwork and oration, sat for less than a heartbeat more. The scroll in his lap, ink barely dried from the night before, slipped slightly as the first man approached. It was Lucius Tillius Cimber who began the performance. A friend, or so Caesar thought, whose voice had once joined the chorus of loyalty that echoed through the Senate. Kimber knelt before him, clutching Caesar's toga with both hands, supposedly begging for the return of his exiled brother. Caesar, maintaining dignity, declined, once, firmly, calmly, and then the hands that pleaded gripped harder. What followed was not a clean assassination, nor a silent moment of swift rebellion. It was a clumsy, brutal, chaotic mess as Kimber yanked Caesar's toga down from his shoulders. Julius Caesar struck first, from behind. The blade grazed the dictator's neck, not deep, not fatal. Caesar wheeled around, shocked not by the pain he'd been wounded before, but by the face. Caesar, trusted, known, fumbling. "What is this, Caesar?" he is said to have asked. Panic took over. Others surged forward. Designed for the solemnity of Senate proceedings. Echoed not with debate, but with the shuffle of sandaled feet and the desperate grunts of men who had never killed. Up close, before Decimus Brutus, stabbed next. Then Gaius Cassius. Then Marcus Brutus, the man whom Caesar had once called his son in everything but name. Blades met flesh. Some struck bone. Others slid through folds of fabric. The attack was not coordinated. It was frenzied, unrehearsed. Some conspirators wounded each other. The room filled with the sounds of sandals scuffing marble, of breathing turned into gasps, of Caesar's body shifting and resisting, and, finally, collapsing. He fell beside the base of the statue of Pompey. Pompey, whose defeat had brought Caesar to power. Pompey, whose curia now served as a temporary senate hall. Pompey, whose likeness watched without judgment as Caesar bled out at his feet. According to some sources, Caesar did not cry out. According to others, he said only a few words, none confirmed, none recorded with certainty. The famous phrase, "Et Brute, you too, Brutus," is remembered, not because it is proven, but because it echoes so precisely the kind of quiet devastation that betrayal brings. What we know for certain is this: Caesar was stabbed 23 times. Only one of the wounds was fatal, and none of them were deserved by paperwork. Afterward, the senators fled, not the conspirators, not immediately. They remained for a moment, covered in blood, uncertain of what came next. There was no plan beyond this act, no speech prepared, no announcement of succession. They had assumed that once Caesar was dead, Republic would breathe again. What breathed instead was fear. Outside, the people of Rome learned of the assassination, not through official declaration, but through whispers and panicked messengers. Shops closed early, citizens scattered. The city held its breath, uncertain whether civil war had resumed. Caesar's body lay abandoned for some time. Eventually, 3 slaves retrieved it and carried it back to his home, trailing blood through the alleys. The scroll he had been reading was never recovered. No one knows what happened to the speech he had written that morning. It was likely discarded, or trampled, or taken by one of the fleeing senators. Perhaps it was never unrolled at all. His funeral came days later. The conspirators, believing they had restored liberty, were stunned when the city did not erupt in applause. The crowds wept. They lit fires. They shouted curses. Emmer, Antony, Caesar's loyal ally, used the occasion not for grief, but for fury. He read Caesar's will aloud, a will that left money to the Roman people, that named his grandnephew Octavian as heir, that promised gardens and wealth, not to the elite, but to the masses. The people saw in Caesar not a tyrant, but a father. The Senate saw in his death not a new republic, but a vacuum. Rome saw in his blood not freedom, but foreboding. In the weeks that followed, nothing was resolved. Octavian rose. Antony maneuvered. The conspirators scattered. Many eventually hunted down or killed. Civil war resumed, not ended. The republic fractured further, not restored, and the paperwork piled up once more. Forms left unsigned, decrees unratified, projects paused. The machinery of state, which Caesar had tended so meticulously, now sputtered in chaos. In the end, it was not the grand speeches, not the dreams of Calpurnia, not even the stabbing itself that undid Rome, but the silence that followed. The failure to build anything in the space left by one man's removal. The Ides of March did not mark an ending. It marked a waiting, a breath between empires, a moment when Rome forgot how to be roamed. And so the world turned. The paperwork unfiled, the scrolls unwritten, and somewhere, perhaps, in the folds of that lost speech, question remains: would the Republic have returned if they hadn't struck? Or was Caesar never the problem, but merely the final version of a system long since broken? Asterisk, by the year 45 BCE, Julius Caesar no longer needed to shout. There was a time when his voice had filled camps, cut through storms, and echoed across battlefields. But now he had something quieter, something heavier, something even more dangerous than a legion. He had letters. Letters bore his thoughts now, not speeches. He sent scrolls, not swords. And in every corner of the Roman world, governors, senators, military commanders, merchants, and magistrates waited for them, a seal pressed in wax. The mark of Caesar's name was enough to silence debate in entire provinces. When his words arrived by courier, men sat down before opening them. They always replied, until they didn't. It began with delays, nothing noticeable. At first, the letters took longer to return. Replies that once came within days now stretched 2 weeks. Some senators cited illness, others claimed travel, poor roads, or messengers delayed by weather. Caesar's aides wrote it down as routine inconvenience. But Caesar, who had once counted the number of days it took to outmaneuver Pompey, counted more than that. He noticed who stopped replying. Lucius, Julius, Poplicola, quiet, precise, known for answering. Within a day, missed 2 letters in a row. Marcus, Junius, Brutus, ever formal, always structured in his replies, grew vague in his tone, then silent altogether. Even Gaius Trebonius, formerly loyal and once swift with praise, replied with clipped lines. No warmth, no suggestions, just the barest confirmation that he had received the scroll. Caesar said nothing aloud, but he adjusted his dictation patterns. He began to repeat names during his morning reviews. He asked his aides, "Did we hear back from Cassius?" Decimus sent the land tally. "Where's the response from Brutus?" No one had a clear answer. The truth was simple. The Senate had grown quiet. It was not a mutiny of voices. It was a mutiny of silence. And in Rome, where alliances were often written, not spoken, that silence echoed louder than any outburst. Senators did not challenge Caesar with declarations. They challenged him by ignoring his ink. But Caesar, unlike most rulers, had once lived by silence. He remembered being ignored. He remembered being a young man of little standing, trying to rise among older, stronger men. He remembered being overlooked by Sulla, mocked by Cicero, underestimated by Crassus. And he remembered how Rome responded to men who didn't shout, how it favored those who waited, and then struck with precision. So he didn't strike back at the silence. He wrote more. One letter to Cassius ended not with veil, the polite farewell, but with a formal command to appear at the next session of the Senate. Another, Decimus, requested not merely a reply, but an explanation. The pattern was subtle but deliberate. Caesar was tightening the leash. He may have been dictator for life, but Rome still required rituals. Men still pretended that the Republic breathed freely, that the Senate governed, that Caesar only guided. Now, as responses dwindled, that fiction began to unravel. Even within Caesar's inner circle, doubts rose. Some of his staff urged him to call out the silence publicly, to accuse, to demand. But Caesar resisted. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew what public accusation did. It forced a choice, and Caesar wasn't ready for the Senate to make one yet, so he sent more letters, scheduled appearances. He approved grants and land distributions. He met foreign envoys. He handed out honors to minor officials, trying to keep the machinery of Rome oiled. He did everything he could to remind them, without saying it aloud, that Rome still flowed through him. But one morning, held a letter that made him pause. It was unsigned. It had no return. Sealed, it listed, in an anonymous hand, the names of men. Men in high offices. Men he knew. Some from war, some from debate, some from long, slow dinners under the stars of a republic they all pretended still lived. The letter ended with one line. They no longer believe in silence. They believe in swords. It was unsigned, unattributed, and left on the marble edge of his reading table. No one knew how it got there, or if someone within had placed it themselves. Caesar read it twice. He didn't destroy it. He placed it in a drawer, and then he dictated 3 more letters that day, each to one of the names listed. Not threatening, not harsh, just invitations, polite, unassuming invitations. To sit closer, to advise on reforms, to attend his next public appearance. There was no mention of betrayal, no acknowledgement of suspicion, only the reminder of a hand extended. A man who still believed in ink, still believed in responses, still believed that silence, cool, though heavy, could be filled again. But as he sealed those letters, the room outside had already changed. Few aides shifted when his name was spoken. The secretary avoided eye contact. A senator, waiting for a meeting, claimed he had urgent business elsewhere and left without explanation. And on Caesar's desk, another parchment sat unopened, a small, creased scroll with no name, no address, no message, only a faint red line slashed across its back, a symbol, a warning, or merely a spilled drop of ink. Caesar never asked. He simply reached for the next blank scroll and dictated again. Asterisk, in Rome. Loyalty was never about feeling. It was about placement. Who you sat next to at dinner, name you listed first in a letter, what your statue faced in a public square, which general you toasted when the amphora was passed around. Everything that looked like friendship was, in fact, alignment, and everything that looked like silence could just as easily be betrayal. This was the stage Caesar found himself upon. Stage of gestures, glances, omissions, not arguments in the Senate, but absences. Not protests in the Forum, but gaps in correspondence. Rome, the ancient city of law and language, had begun to communicate in what it left unsaid. Caesar, seated in his private office above the Forum, still sent out messages daily. His staff recorded every dispatch with care. His scribes used fresh ink and sharpened styluses. His messengers rode through gates before dawn. On parchment, Rome still hummed with order, but behind the facade, more names had gone quiet. Publius, Cerilius, Casca, Gaius, Ligurius, Quintus, Tillius, Kinber, all men of standing. All previously regular correspondents, all now missing from Caesar's daily briefing logs. They had stopped writing back, and in doing so, they were saying everything they needed to the untrained eye. This looked like normal government disarray. Rome was sprawling. Smell went astray. Governors were delayed. Secretaries forgot. Tenna, he had been a general. He had commanded in Gaul and Spain. He knew the difference between accident and pattern. This was a pattern, and it was sharpening among his most trusted aides. A few dared to speculate aloud. One, an elderly freedman who had served Caesar since his youth, gently remarked, "It is not the messages that change, my lord. It is the listeners." That day, Caesar requested a full list of all current Senate members and their attendance record. over the past month. He studied it as though it were a battle map, cross-referenced it with those who had not responded to his recent letters. K marked absences. He noted sudden returns to the city. K. He noticed which men had passed through the gates of Rome under cover of night and never requested a meeting. It became clear that something was building. Not a rebellion, not yet, but a rehearsal of one. Some senators had begun to avoid Caesar's gaze in public. Others fumbled their words in private. K, at a recent dinner, meant to celebrate the dedication of a minor temple. The air had been thick with avoidance. K, men toasted the wine, but not the host. The laughter was shallow, the exit quick, and the silence of the letters continued. Brutus, always the most measured of them all, had not replied in weeks. Not even a messenger sent by hand was granted entrance. His house, though lit, remained closed. Brutus, the one man Caesar had always trusted, to disagree with dignity. The one man he believed still believed in the Republic. Without wanting to destroy him for it, even Brutus had stopped writing. Caesar didn't summon him, not yet. Instead, he began a campaign of patience. He published edicts in the Forum with deliberate blandness. Nothing controversial, nothing divisive. He praised the Senate for their wisdom in a recent tax judgment, despite knowing full well it had been passed without his involvement. He ordered modest food distributions to the urban poor, hoping to remind the people that bread still flowed under his rule. He even made a speech, short, carefully worded, public. He spoke of peace, of the Roman soul, of rebuilding the institutions that had once made the Republic strong. There were no threats in his tone, no warnings, but anyone listening closely would have heard it. He was buying time. He was giving the Senate one final chance to come back to the table. But the Senate had already moved the table, quietly, strategically, away from him in hushed corners of private villas. Men now met without parchment. They discussed not laws, but methods, not debates, but timing. The letters they had once received from Caesar now lay folded in drawers or burned in fires. Symbolic dismissals of a man they had once followed. And when Caesar's latest dispatch arrived, a personal letter to Decimus Brutus, inviting him to oversee the dedication of a new monument near the Campus Martis. It was met not with excitement or gratitude, but with calculation. They were keeping track of his words, too, studying them, looking for signs of weakness. Caesar, ever the strategist, knew this. He had lived through too many betrayals to miss the scent of another. He had written too many letters not to know when the recipient wasn't just ignoring him, but deliberately choosing not to respond. But he had one more move left. He began writing letters again, not to the senators, but to the people. Open letters, public declarations, carefully worded essays on unity, on the virtues of law, on the greatness of Roman peace. He paid for their distribution. He had them read aloud in public spaces. He sent copies to provinces. It was the oldest trick in Roman politics. If the elite grow quiet, speak to the crowd, and the people listened. Not all, not many with full conviction, but enough to remind the Senate that Caesar's words still echoed in courtyards and under balconies, that his voice still held weight beyond the marble steps of the Curia. Still, the replies did not return, and one very small, unrecorded day, a young courier returned from a senator's house with Caesar's unopened letter still in hand. He said, the courier explained, eyes averted, that he had nothing to say in reply. That senator was Gaius Cassius Longinus, and Caesar, upon hearing the message, said nothing at all. He simply took the letter back, unbroken, unread, and placed it in the drawer beside the others. The drawer was cedar-lined, teed, not for preservation, but for scent. Caesar liked the way it masked the smell of old ink and wax. It was shallow, just deep enough to hold a few scrolls and a carved bronze stylus. At the bottom of it, buried beneath folded parchments and unopened replies, lay the truth he had chosen not to confront. Silence was no longer delay. It was intention. Rome had written back to Caesar for years, even when it hated him, even when it feared him, even when he crossed the Rubicon and the Senate scattered. There were always words, always something. But now, in the weeks before the IADs, Rome's ruling class had simply gone quiet. And not just in letters, they passed by his litter without greeting. They attended Senate sessions, but refused to speak in committee. They voted only on unimportant motions, ritual, gestures, with no real consequence. They praised him in absentia, but fell silent in his presence. It was a kind of death for death, not assassination, hence communication. Caesar, single quotes, a secretary, a young man named Publius, began recording the dates of silence in a small side ledger. It wasn't official, just a private task, a log of unanswered scrolls and postponed meetings, a list of names. Beside each one, Publius wrote a single letter. D for delayed, N for no response, C for cold reply by mid-March. The margins were full. Still, Caesar kept writing. Some part of him, perhaps, believed that correspondence itself was proof of order, that Rome could not truly fall into chaos so long as he continued the rituals of governance. K, that the act of dictation was, in its own way, a resistance to collapse. So, he continued. He composed a message to Brutus, long, patient, filled with references to their past debates on law and liberty. He wrote to Cicero, offering compliments on a recent essay. He sent a copy of a grain report to Cassius with a note, praising the senator's steady hand in fiscal matters. None replied, but Caesar didn't stop. Instead, he shifted strategy. He began drafting internal memos, not for the Senate, but for his own staff. Memos about procedural changes, about scheduling reforms, about safety protocols for public appearances. Last of these, dated just 4 days before the IEDs, included a brief paragraph on altering the seating arrangement in the Senate chamber. He suggested that men with known grievances be seated nearer to the center, rather than at the perimeter. No one acted on it. No one commented. The memo disappeared into the same drawer where the unread letters lay. And yet, even as the silence grew louder, Caesar made no arrests. He summoned no guards. He did not close the Senate. He did not flee. Why? Historians still argue. Some say he was arrogant, convinced that no Roman would dare strike the living symbol of victory and peace, or say he was tired, not of ruling, but of bracing. Caddy had lived too long under threat to believe that one more silence was different from the last. But perhaps the answer is more mundane. Perhaps Caesar believed that Rome could still be spoken to, that as long as words remained, wounds could be avoided. He had, after all, risen by words, letters to legions, letters to governors, letters to the people. Maybe he thought betrayal would arrive with noise, not stillness. And so, on the morning of the Ides, Caesar opened that drawer one last time. He removed a scroll from its stack, the last reply from Brutus, written months earlier, before the silences began. He read it slowly, then placed it back. Then he stood. He wrapped his toga. He greeted his household, ignored the warnings of his wife, listened quietly to the cautious voices of his aides, and then stepped outside into the gray light of a city already grieving what it would not admit had been lost. And as he walked toward the theater of Pompey, where the Senate awaited him with blades instead of ballots, the drawer remained behind, closed, full, silent, a private tomb of what could have been said, a record not of rebellion, but of refusal, because in the end, they didn't kill Caesar with swords. They killed him with silence, and no reply. Asterisk, Marcus Tullius. Cicero did not fear daggers. He feared perfume. More precisely, he feared its sudden presence, the shift in a room's aroma, the trace of lavender oil or myrrh where none had been before, the scent of power misused, of softness used to disguise something sharp. For Cicero, danger did not announce itself with shouting. It whispered with scented robes. By 44 BCE, he had learned this the hard way. Cicero, once consul, once savior of the Republic, or so he liked to believe, had watched Rome shift under his sandals. The Republic he defended with words had begun to bend under swords and crowns and laurel wreaths worn too long. And the man wearing those wreaths did not smell like war anymore. He smelled like luxury, like foreign oils rubbed into arms once, armored in dust, like incense imported from Alexandria, like the slow drift of lilies at a dinner where senators laughed too quickly. Cicero noticed. He noticed everything, and he wrote about it, quietly, carefully, in the margins of his scrolls, and in the pauses of his letters. While Caesar marched and ruled, Cicero observed. Not as a rival, not even as a resistance leader, but as a man who believed words might still hold the world together. He had retired more than once, fled Rome when its winds blew too hard, returned when it was safe to speak again, and in his final return, just months before the Ides, he had hoped that quiet civility might resume. But civility, he realized, now came perfumed. He began to keep a log, not of speeches, not of laws, of smells. At each Senate meeting, he made a mental note: which men wore what cologne, who arrived with scented oils on their hair, who used incense in their home offices, who had recently imported spices or resins through Eastern traders. It was more than eccentricity. It was a code. Perfume to Cicero was the language of corruption, a signal that a man no longer felt the need to hide his wealth, that he had stopped fearing the judgment of the Republic, that he had begun to decorate his conscience. Julius Caesar wore perfume often in those days. It was faint, subtle, not the overwhelming kind used by New Voyage merchants or bored aristocrats. It was refined rosewater, sometimes, or cinnamon oil, something that lingered, but never shouted, and that's why Cicero feared it most, because it meant Caesar had stopped hiding in private. Cicero remarked to a friend when he smelled of sweat, he was still ours. Now he smells of God's. Cicero never confronted Caesar directly. He was too practiced for that, too weary. He had written against kings, not emperors, against traitors, not gods. But he saw what the perfumes meant. It wasn't just Caesar who changed. It was the senators around him. Men who once dressed plainly began appearing in robes, stitched with gold. Oils were traded among allies like gifts. The forums began to reek of celebration rather than caution. Even minor officials started holding feasts scented with imported spices. It was not abundance that disturbed Cicero. It was arrogance, and he sensed what came next. At one dinner, shortly before the Ides, Cicero arrived late. The room was warm with candlelight and filled with a sweet haze, a mixture of honey, crushed herbs, and something sharper. Perhaps frankincense, perhaps fear. The senator smiled, drank, laughed too loudly. Cicero sat in silence. He watched how they leaned in to speak, how their laughter came too quickly, then dropped too suddenly. He smelled the perfume on Decimus Brutus, strong that evening, too strong. He noted the way Cassius avoided his eyes, how Trebonius's fingers trembled when reaching for figs. He recorded none of it, but when he returned home, he burned his tunic, not from ritual, but because it carried that scent, that trace of oil and rot that meant the Republic was no longer breathing still. He did not speak. He knew the danger of open words. He had lived through Purges, through Sulla, through Catiline. He had seen how quickly a pen could become a noose. So, instead, he wrote in riddles. In his letters to Atticus, he hinted at shadows. At dinners that felt more like funerals. At Senate sessions where silence sat heavier than debate. He never named names. He didn't need to, because by then, anyone paying attention could smell it too. The shift in Rome wasn't in laws, Lou. It wasn't in armies. It was in incense curling through columns, in oils rubbed into hands that once signed edicts of restraint, in gifts exchanged not as gratitude, but as binding favors. And in the silence that followed, perfume was never just fragrance. It was a smokescreen, veiled away to make betrayal smell like civility. And Cicero, alone among them, still remembered what Rome smelled like when it was free. Asterisk by the last weeks of February, 44 BCE. The scent of Rome was no longer one of earth and oil but of honeyed wine, crushed rose petals, and the bitter trace of foreign incense. Perfume hung in the air like a curtain, draped over politics and stitched into every pleasantry. Cicero found himself coughing more, not because he was unwell, because the city itself seemed to exhale things it used to hold in. Even the letters now carried fragrance. It had begun innocently enough. Senator's scroll arrived with a soft lavender scent. Then another, touched with a dusting of something floral, maybe violet or sandalwood. Cicero would open them, read the contents brief, courteous, blandant, then fold them away. He began to keep them separate from the rest. He did not burn these letters. He stored them in a box that, like Caesar's drawer of unanswered scrolls, was never officially acknowledged. Sat beneath his desk, sealed with a simple wooden clasp. To anyone else, it was just storage. To Cicero, it was a record of change, of mood, of scent. He knew perfume was not guilt, but it was a symptom. Men who once walked through the forum in plain wool togas now arrived in imported fabrics, oiled and spotless. The perfume was not just for themselves. The scent was for others, to be seen, to be noticed, to be remembered, especially if that memory might have to defend them later. It was an alibi before the crime. Cicero began writing more letters to Atticus. He didn't say what he feared. He never mentioned daggers or conspiracies, but his phrases grew sharper. He used metaphors, old parables. He wrote of sails changing direction even before the wind moves, and gardens blooming out of season. Atticus, clever as ever. Understood, asterisk, he replied with coded language of his own observations about trade routes, sudden changes in the Senate's tone, and odd behavior from men once known for consistency. Still, neither named Caesar, not directly, because to name him was to summon something larger than politics to speak. Caesar's name in that climate was like striking flint. Instead, Cicero focused on gestures, not grand betrayals, but little abandonments. Brutus had stopped greeting him with full formality. Cassius no longer lingered for a philosophical debate. Trebonius once praised Cicero's oratory now. He simply nodded. Asterisk. And at the latest Senate session, something shifted again. Caesar arrived late. He wore a deep crimson sash. His shoulders were scented with something unmistakably foreign, likely from Egypt, a gift perhaps from Cleopatra's last envoy. The scent hit Cicero as soon as Caesar entered. It clung to the air, mixing with the heat of the marble and the sweat of senators crammed into too narrow a chamber. And for the first time, Cicero found himself distracted during a reading of legislation. He stared at the folds of Caesar's robe, at the ring on his hand, gold glinting with emerald. But the way his voice echoed slightly too long. This was not the general he had once written against. This was a figure of something else, larger, too complete, too scented. And when the meeting adjourned, Caesar walked by Cicero without pause. Cicero turned, half expecting some gesture and nod, a glance, even a sneer. But there was nothing, just the faint drift of perfume. He returned home that day and wrote No letters. Instead, he sat beside the cedar box and opened it. The fragrances rose softly, trapped between folded scrolls and dried wax. He inhaled, slowly, not out of nostalgia, but caution. He read through the messages again. Most said very little. Few were invitations to dinners. One was a thank you for a recommendation. Another confirmed a building contract had been approved. They were polite, efficient, completely hollow. That was what unsettled him most. Not what was said, but how clean it all sounded. Too clean, like perfume sprayed over rot. That night, Cicero slept poorly. He dreamed of fire not ablaze, but a slow burn, licking the edges of scrolls. In the dream, the letters curled and blackened, and the scent was sweet, almost pleasant. When he awoke, he ordered the household to prepare his travel cases. Not to flee, he said, just to prepare for the countryside. For rest, no one believed him because the air in Rome was no longer breathable. He sent one final letter that week. This one to Brutus. No perfume, no wax, skill, just plain parchment in his careful hand. He didn't accuse, he didn't plead. He asked one question. If Rome survives without breath, will she still be Rome? He received no reply, but he hadn't expected one, because replies, like perfume, had become a kind of performance, and Cicero, more than any other man in Rome, had stopped believing in performance. Asterisk, the day after the Ides of March. The streets of Rome smelled like smoke and metal, not the heavy smoke of fire, but the thin kind, the smoke of burnt offerings, singed paper, the last of the oil lamps left too long unattended. The metallic scent wasn't blood, not yet. It was brass, bronze, iron, the cold temps of unsheathed power. The air was shifting. Cicero stood at the edge of it all. He had not been in the Senate chamber when the knives were drawn. He had avoided the session entirely, citing exhaustion. A lie, perhaps, or maybe an instinct. Either way, he wasn't there when Caesar fell, but the scent reached him regardless. Not literal perfume this time. That had vanished. In its place was the stark, bitter odor of consequences. The conspirators called it liberation. They claimed the Republic had been restored. They walked through the forum as if their silence had finally shouted. But Cicero knew better, because the moment Caesar died, perfume disappeared. Not just the scent, but the entire theater. The lavish robes were discarded in haste. The oils were wiped off. The senators who once anointed their necks and wrists now trembled with blood on their tunics and dirt on their sandals. The performance was over. The masks were gone, and what lay beneath was nothing. No plan, no republic waiting in the wings. Just fear. The very fear Cicero had smelled beneath the perfumes in the first place. In the days that followed, the city convulsed. Crowds wailed. Soldiers stood uncertainly by. Mark Antony rose like steam from a hidden chamber, his speeches igniting the mob. Caesar's will was read aloud. The gardens he left to the people became symbols of betrayal, not his betrayal, theirs. Cicero watched it all and said little. He had survived again, not because he was lucky, but because he had learned to spot danger, not by declaration, but by scent, attack. Learned to listen, not to words, but to the quiet withdrawal of them. Learned that in Rome, loyalty could wear roses. That treachery often arrived powdered, with hands clean and scented. Bearing compliments, he opened the cedar box once final time. The letters were still there, unburned, unread. He took out the one from Cassius, the most fragrant. Still carried the faintest trace of saffron oil. Almost gone now. Cicero unrolled it, read its bland contents again, then rolled it tight and placed it in a pouch, not as evidence, but as memory, because Cicero understood what the perfumes had tried to cover, a city that no longer wanted to think, only to feel. Rome had tired of reason. It had turned to sensation. and when sensation failed, it reached for steel. He spent the next weeks writing, but not to senators, to history. His letters now became records. His speeches became reflections. He wrote of justice, of the state, of the soul, of the republic. Not as a politician, as a mourner. And slowly, the scent of perfume was replaced by something harsher. Ash, ink, sweat, the smells of war returning, because Brutus and Cassius fled, and Octavian arrived, and Antony would not be silenced, and Cicero would not survive them. Not this time, not with words. He knew that his end would come, not with fragrance, but with execution. He felt it in the wind. He wrote as much. His last letters, dictated from a countryside estate, held none of the sharpness of his youth, only sorrow. But he had one final request, that none of his scrolls be perfumed, that the parchment remain plain, that the record, however long it lasted, smell of truth, not theater, so that someday, when someone opened a drawer or lifted a lid, they would not be distracted by sweetness, nor fooled by softness. They would smell Rome as it really was. Asterisk. The Ides of March began with a missed meal. It was not dramatic. It was not out of character, but it was unusual. Julius Caesar, who prized routine even more than triumph, had skipped his breakfast on the 15th of March, 44 BCE. It would become, in hindsight, the most studied and interpreted absence of food in Roman history. Caesar's mornings, for all their grandeur in the Senate and spectacle in the Forum, typically began in quiet simplicity. He was not a man of lavish breakfasts, a piece of bread soaked in watered wine or dipped in oil, a bit of goat cheese, occasionally dates, if his physician approved. But the ritual was consistent. Food first, then ink, then power. That day, though, was different. He rose later than usual, disturbed by Calpurnia's dreams, by a sense of disquiet that settled into the marble walls of his villa like a damp fog. She had begged him not to leave the house, not because she feared war or scandal, but because she had seen it in her sleep. Step. He listened more than he usually did. He didn't argue. He didn't dismiss her. For the first time in years, Caesar hesitated. He remained in his chamber longer than usual. The slaves who laid out his breakfast waited, then waited longer. When no command came, they quietly removed the tray. No bread, no wine, no morning nourishment, just silence. Caesar did not explain why. He dressed slowly. His attendants tied his sandals, folded the red-bordered toga over his shoulder, and scented his skin with faint rose oil. He said little. The room smelled clean, almost too clean. No food, no warmth, only the cold scent of stone and ceremony outside. The streets of Rome moved as they always did, restless, dusty, unbothered by the movements of power. The Forum buzzed faintly with early merchants. Priests at nearby temples prepared sacrifices for the midday rites. At the theater of Pompey, the Senate was already beginning to gather. Quietly, tense. Still, Caesar hesitated. It was Decimus Brutus who arrived to stir him, a friend, a former general under his command, a man who, history would soon note, stood among the conspirators. But that morning, Decimus was a messenger, a coaxer. He reminded Caesar of his responsibilities, that the Senate awaited him, that rumors would grow if he stayed home, that Calpurnia's fears, though well-meaning, must not outweigh the state. Caesar listened. He didn't object. He didn't eat. Asterisk. He rose, adjusted his sash, and left. It wasn't until the litter was halfway down the Palatine slope that his attendant, Gnaeus, whispered, "You've not had anything today, my lord." Caesar didn't answer. It's possible he didn't hear, or didn't care, or simply knew that food, not settle what was already stirring inside him. The journey to the theater of Pompey took less than half an hour. The city, as always, paid attention without appearing to. Shopkeepers nodded. A few citizens bowed, but the gaze was different, more curious, more careful. Something unspoken seemed to hum in the streets. It wasn't until the litter turned onto the final approach to the theater that Caesar looked up at the sky. Pale, thin clouds drifting slowly westward. No birds in flight in Rome. That was enough to unsettle a priest. It should have unsettled a statesman. At the theater steps, he paused. Again, not long. Just a moment. Asterisk. Just long enough to notice a senator standing oddly still beside a pillar. Just long enough to glance at the open doors of the Senate chamber, which looked darker than usual. Just long enough to feel something, a hunger, not in the stomach, but somewhere deeper. He reached for just a second to rub his chest, then stepped inside. History records no direct correlation between Caesar's skipped breakfast and his assassination, but the absence lingered in the memories of those who survived. His cook later remarked that the bread went stale by noon, that it sat uneaten for hours before it was thrown to the birds. His physician noted quietly that Caesar's body had not the usual warmth at the time of his death, that his pulse, when checked in the aftermath, had likely been slower than usual. That fatigue may have made him slower to rise, slower to resist, slower to see. And yet none of these things caused what came next. They only framed it. A missed meal, a drawn breath, a silence where a ritual once stood. That was how the day began. Not with thunder, not with prophecy, not even with argument, but with an empty table, and a man who had grown tired of routine. Asterisk, the chamber where Julius Caesar entered that morning was not built for kings. The Curia of Pompey, repurposed hall behind the stage of the old theater, was intended for debate, not death. Its walls, though tall and dressed in muted murals, were stained with time. The marble floors, worn by years of sandals and ambition, echoed strangely. There was no throne, dais, just rows of curved benches in the space in the middle where Rome once remembered how to argue. On that morning, the benches were full, but not with voices, with bodies, silent, seated bodies. Men who once challenged Caesar now smiled faintly. Men who once spoke too loudly now looked at the floor. And above it all, the scent of nothing. No incense, no wine, no roasted meats from a morning banquet. Just stone, sweat, and the faint oil of sharpened steel still hidden beneath two gas. Caesar entered hungry. Not visibly, but it showed in the small sag of his shoulders, in the weight of his gait, in the way he rested his hand, briefly, on the back of a senator's chair instead of walking directly to his seat. A moment of pause, a flicker of weariness. No food in the gut, no fire in the blood. It would have gone unnoticed had anyone cared to see it, but everyone was watching something else, watching each other, waiting for movement, waiting for the first word, the first plea, the first knife. But before the knives, there was a conversation, brief, formal, hollow. Lucius Tillius Kimber stepped forward. He bowed, respectfully, as if he were requesting a minor favor. "Your Excellency," he said, "I beg a petition. My brother." The rest of the sentence was lost to movement. Hands reached, togas shifted. Caesar stepped back, confused, not afraid, not yet, but confused, because the performance was too much. The pleading was exaggerated, the physical contact too sudden. One hand yanked his toga from his shoulder, another pushed his arm back, a third gripped his wrist. He tried to speak, tried to move, but the men were too close now, and he was too hungry. Casca struck first, a short blade, not long enough for war, but long enough for surprise, slashed across Caesar's upper shoulder. Not deep, not clean. A desperate cut made by someone who had never stabbed a man before. Caesar turned, grunted. Then it happened. Dozens of movements, not simultaneous, not rehearsed, frantic, loud, confused. There were no shouted slogans, no rallying cries, just the wet sound of skin being torn, of sandals scraping the marble, of robes twisting around bodies as men pushed, pulled, and plunged 20-3 wounds. That's what the physicians would later count. But only one was truly fatal. The rest were noise, symbol, participation, men who didn't want to be left out of the deed, men who were afraid of being seen as hesitant, men who had dined with Caesar just weeks before, now striking him, not because they hated him, but because they feared being the only ones who hadn't. In Caesar, he didn't scream, he didn't plead. He looked at each face. Some historians say he pulled his toga over his head. Others say he stumbled forward, seeking refuge at the feet of Pompey's statue, the man whose defeat had made him king in all but name. But before that, before the fall, before the blood, Caesar saw Brutus and said nothing. Not et2. Not. Why? Just. Nothing. Because that silence was already written on Brutus's face. He had seen the same silence in the Senate for months, in the unread letters, in the skipped responses, in the sudden scent of perfume on men who used to smell like parchment and ash, in the refusal to meet his gaze, in the absence of voices where opposition once sat. The knives were merely punctuation. The betrayal had already been composed. He collapsed at the base of the statue. His blood pooled in the lines between the tiles, soaked into the hem of his robe, into the sandals of the senators, into the pages of the speech he never gave. He had missed breakfast, and now Rome would miss him. Not immediately, not universally, but eventually, because what followed wasn't restoration, it was reckoning. And the empty plate at Caesar's table remained empty, not just of food, but of the Republic itself. Asterisk, long after the Senate chamber had emptied and the blood had cooled into a dull maroon smear across the marble. Someone remembered the tray. It was still there, in the corner of Caesar's study, untouched, half-covered, left exactly as it had been that morning. It's a simple loaf of bread, it's a wedge of cheese, slightly browned at the edges, a clay cup filled with diluted wine, surface stilled, and now flecked with dust. One of his household slaves removed the cloth, then hesitated. He didn't eat it. He didn't throw it away. He just stood there, looking, because that meal, that small, ordinary plate, had become something sacred. Not because Caesar had touched it, but because he hadn't. It was the last act of a man who ruled the Republic, and then, slowly, without meaning to, found himself ruled by its ghosts. The assassins had not entered Caesar's home. They hadn't poisoned his food or desecrated his chambers. They hadn't needed to. The real theater wasn't in his villa. It was in a place where words were supposed to matter and hadn't for years. And so, tray was left on the table all day, all night, as if waiting by the time Caesar's body was brought back, carried through alleys by servants, to stunned, to speak. The bread had grown hard. The wine had dried to a ring. The cheese had stiffened into a waxy curl. The villa fell silent in Rome. News spread fast and unevenly. Some heard within the hour. Some didn't believe it until the next morning. Some the kind of people who had never seen Caesar, but spoke of him in the markets as if they had treated it like a holiday, but not at the Palatine house. There, the silence was different. Calpurnia, his wife, did not weep publicly. She ordered the body cleaned, wrapped, and laid out with care. She summoned no priests, no senators. She refused to receive visitors. She simply asked that the tray be removed and nothing be touched until she said otherwise. And for 2 days, no one touched a thing. The scrolls on Caesar's desk remained unsealed. The ink in the pot dried. The messages from provinces sat unread. Somewhere in the pile was the unfinished land reform decree he had planned to announce that, afternoon, just before the knives found his ribs. But now those plans were folded neatly beside the bread he hadn't eaten, and the Republic, which the conspirators claimed to love, sat paralyzed, not restored, not invigorated, just still, because they hadn't killed a tyrant. They had removed a center of gravity without Caesar. Everything that orbited around him, alliances, rivalries, fears, began to drift. Senators who had sharpened blades one day spoke in whispers. The next, some fled. Others barricaded their estates. A few, like Brutus, walked the streets with wide eyes, unsure whether they had killed a man or lit a fuse. Mark Antony moved quickly. He did not take power by force, not yet. He took it by words. At Caesar's funeral, he delivered not a eulogy, but a reintroduction. He reminded Rome who Caesar had been, what he had done, how he had forgiven his enemies, how he had loved the people, and how the people now were left with nothing. Then he read the will. It was theatrical, strategic, brutal. Caesar, in death, had left money to every citizen of Rome, land to his soldiers, gardens to the public. The wealth of a ruler handed back to the crowd, and the crowd, in turn, remembered why they had once chanted his name. That night, fires burned, not in the villas of the conspirators, not yet, but in the forum, in the hearts of the people, in the sudden understanding that something final had happened. Cicero, watching from a distance, wrote that Caesar died without finishing a single paragraph of what he had intended. But he was wrong. Caesar had finished something. He had written the ending with absence, not with force, not with declaration, not with revenge, with a skipped meal, with an unopened scroll, with a look at the sky, and a refusal to eat what he could not stomach. That morning, when he arose, he chose not to follow his routine. That may seem trivial, but Rome was built on ritual, on repetition, on the comfort of the expected. And when Caesar broke that pattern, when he left the bread untouched and the wine unsipped, something else broke with it. A thread that had held the fiction of the Republic together. Now, in the vacuum of that missing breakfast, came the hunger of the people, the hunger of Antony, the hunger of Octavian, waiting quietly beyond the city's walls, and the endless, bottomless hunger of a world that could no longer go back. The tray was eventually removed, the bread discarded, the plate cleaned. But the silence of that missing meal still echoes in history, the final, uneaten breakfast of a man who ruled without a crown and died without a bite. 3 days before the Ides of March. A meeting was held in Rome that no one recorded, not officially. No minutes were taken, no scribes were present, no votes were cast. It wasn't held in the Senate, nor in the Forum, nor in any of the usual places where men shaped laws and futures. It was not technically a meeting at all. It was a conversation, a gathering, a slow, careful convergence of men who had not spoken plainly in years. And it was the meeting that changed everything. It took place in the shaded atrium of a private villa, one of those inconspicuous homes that belonged to no great house, had no distinct family history, and was never mentioned in odes. The kind of place chosen not for its prestige, but for its forgettability. It belonged to a cousin of someone important, or perhaps a loyal freedman. The details, as always, were blurred to protect the powerful from their own memories. The participants arrived separately. Casca, first, quiet and sharp-eyed. Dan, Decimus.com, but worn. Cassius, later, his shoulders tense. Cabonius, followed. Ligurius, Kimber, and finally, Brutus. Marcus Junius Brutus walked in last, not because he wanted to, because he had to. There had been whispers about a meeting for weeks, quiet hints traded in the colonnades of temples, in the corners of libraries, under the roar of fountains where sound couldn't carry. But now it was happening, and they all knew why. They didn't speak immediately, okay? The atrium was dim, the air cool despite the Roman spring. The sound of a water basin trickled nearby. For a moment, they simply sat, looking at the floor, or their hands, toward the light as it filtered through the silk curtains. Cassius broke the silence, not with rage, with a question. Does anyone here believe he will step down? No one answered, because they didn't believe it. Not anymore. Julius Caesar had been declared dictator in perpetuity, title that, while technically lawful, felt far too final for men raised in the rhythm of consuls and senatorial balance. Rome had always believed in rotation. Even its emperors would one day pretend to be merely first among equals. But Caesar, he had dropped the pretense, and that was the danger. Cassius leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. That wasn't his style. He spoke like a lawyer reviewing a case, calm, citing facts, recent decrees, the removal of key magistrates, the changing of traditional rituals, the elevation of men too loyal, too eager, too obvious. He pointed out that Caesar now sat during Senate meetings, something no one had done before, that his statues bore not the toga but the armor, that foreign dignitaries now addressed him as king, even if the title was technically refused. And then Cassius asked again, does anyone here believe this ends with his retirement? This time, Brutus answered, no, that was all just one word. But it was enough, because Brutus was the hinge, the conscience, the symbol. He was descended from the very man who had helped overthrow Rome's last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus. His name alone carried the scent of the Republic, even as that Republic crumbled under marble columns and floral tributes to a man who had, by now, made himself its spine. Brutus didn't rant. He didn't promise anything. He just admitted, finally, what everyone in the room already knew. Caesar would not stop, and so they began to plan. Not in specifics. Not yet. This was still the kind of meeting that could be forgotten if necessary. They spoke in riddles, in half-sentences. They used old legal metaphors, nullifying an appointment, ending a term early, correcting an imbalance. Right. The meaning was clear. They weren't going to stop Caesar. They were going to remove him. The discussion turned to timing. The festival of the Ides was approaching. The Senate would meet at the theater of Pompey. Caesar would attend. The security would be minimal. He had refused bodyguards for months now, believing, perhaps arrogantly, that his popularity was enough to shield him. It would have to happen then, before he could leave for his campaign in the East, before more titles could be invented, before the last fragile illusion of the Republic was folded and placed beneath his feet. They discussed who might join them. Some names were offered, others rejected, not for loyalty, but for cowardice. This wasn't a rebellion. It was a narrowing, a surgical correction. They convinced themselves of this. One even said, as the meeting wound down, we're not murdering a man, we're freeing a city. Brutus didn't respond to that line. Instead, he stood. He looked at the others, not with defiance or grief, but with the quiet stare of a man already imagining how history would frame him, and knowing it might lie. He left the atrium first. The others followed, one by one, disappearing into the slow shadows of the city. Rome moved on, as it always did. Shops opened, the baths filled, the forum buzzed with minor complaints about taxes and trade. But something had shifted, something permanent, and in a house not far away. Caesar reviewed a draft of legislation, dipped a quill into ink, and prepared for a meeting he believed would be like all the others. Asterisk. The conspirators did not gather again in one room, not all together, not in the way they had in the atrium. With silence, thick, and decisions freshly made. After that, everything became fragmented, risky, specific, safer in a way. more dangerous, and every other. In Rome, there were 100 ways to meet without meeting. A shared glance in the forum, a whispered line in a bathhouse, a pause too long outside a villa gate. The city had been built for theater, so now it became the stage of the quietest play it would ever perform. Cassius took the lead in logistics. He moved like a man whose words had always been heavier than his blade. His letters, sent under layers of secrecy, passed through couriers who didn't know their own masters. He whispered instructions in taverns under the thudding of drinking songs. He rehearsed the path from the Senate chamber door to the central seat, counting the number of steps it would take to reach Caesar. Decimus focused on the moment. He spoke to Caesar as a friend, dined with him, advised him on political optics. He reminded him to stay calm in the face of rumors, and, most importantly, reassured him again and again that the Senate still loved him. He was the mask, Casca was the hand. He practiced his draw, not formally, not in courtyards like a gladiator, but in alleys alone. He rehearsed a movement of pulling a blade from beneath the folds of a toga, how to make it look like an accident, how to do it quickly, how to start a storm without shouting thunder. A moment at the door, a simple touch on the elbow to steer him the wrong way, enough to separate Caesar from protection and Brutus. Brutus did not plan. He suffered. Each hour brought new weight. He spoke little in public. Fewer letters, fewer meals. He was seen at libraries, at temples, walking alone with a kind of purpose that looked like mourning, because Brutus didn't see a tyrant. He saw Caesar, the man who had wept with him after the death of Brutus's father, the man who had once joked about Brutus's obsession with Stoic texts, the man who, more than once, had handed him scrolls of state matters with the quiet phrase, "You're better at this than I am." Brutus had believed it. That was the problem. This wasn't about saving the public. Not for Brutus. It was about the terrible math of obligation, of a name too famous to live quietly, of a man too powerful to let go on. He would kill the man who had praised him and hope history would understand. The planning never became official. There was no list of roles, no document of intent, just an agreement carved into the dust between Rome's paving stones. The knives would be small, easy to hide, easy to draw. No one would carry more than one. There would be no guards to overpower. Caesar had none. No escape plan, no next step. Just the act, because the next step would not belong to them. It would belong to the city, to its chaos, to whatever came after. The night before the Ides, the final pieces were placed. Caesar, though troubled, had agreed to attend the Senate. Calpurnius. Dreams had disturbed him, but Decimus had soothed him again. He would go. He would arrive just before noon. The Senate would gather, as usual. In the Curia of Pompey, the space had been prepared. Quietly, seats were arranged. The central bench was left clear, and the men who had practiced their lines without ever speaking them aloud walked home with full stomachs, full hearts, and something emptier beneath it all. The knowledge that they were about to do something that could never be undone. And somewhere, in another part of Rome, a scribe dipped a pen into ink and recorded the day's events, never knowing that the next morning, every schedule would be shattered, that the blades had already been sharpened by silence. Asterisk. The morning of the Ides did not begin with blood. It began with seats, polished, curved, arranged in near-perfect symmetry. The curia at the theater of Pompey had been cleaned the day before. Dust swept, floors rubbed down with cloths soaked in wine vinegar. Not because anyone expected celebration, but because a meeting was scheduled. And when Rome scheduled, it obeyed. Slaves opened the tall doors early. Sunlight didn't enter directly, but it hung in the corners of the chamber, like steam, low, golden, unsettling. The benches remained empty for a while, just the sound of birds outside and the faint creaking of the heavy ceiling timbers. Then they began to arrive, one by one. Cassius, first, then Trebonius, then Kimber, then Ligurus. Casca entered without eye contact. Decimus arrived fashionably late. As always, none of them spoke. They sat apart. They knew better than to gather together. That would look suspicious. Instead, they acted like senators, like public men with ordinary business. Casca held a scroll. Cassius inspected his ring. King Bear leaned back, legs crossed, staring toward the door, but not at it. Each heartbeat heavier than the last dot. And then Brutus entered. He walked slowly, not cautiously, deliberately, like a man who had measured every step before taking it. His face was unreadable, not because it hid emotion, but because it had simply stopped trying. He took his seat directly across from the central chair, where Caesar would sit, where he always sat outside. Caesar was late. He had risen late. He had hesitated. Calpurnia had begged again. The dream had returned. She had seen the roof fall, heard the shout, seen him crumble beneath the statue, the very statue of Pompey. But Decimus had arrived again, this time with confidence, with charm, with precisely the right amount of concern. Not denial, just steadiness. "If you do not go," he said softly, "they will say you are afraid." It was the only word that worked. Afraid. Caesar stood. He dressed, but he moved slowly. He skipped food again. His attendants remarked it silently. A second morning without bread or wine. He requested no perfumes, no formal procession, just a litter. In the simple weight of his presence, the senators and the curia waited. No jokes, no complaints, no idle chatter about weather or taxes, just waiting. The longer it lasted, the sharper their fear grew. What if he changed his mind? What if Calpurnia's warning held? What if he stayed home? But then, in the distance, footsteps, echoing, not through stone, but through breath. A guard's voice murmuring, a door creaking, a pause. Then Caesar appeared, not with a roar, with a nod. He entered the chamber quietly. He walked with the stiffness of a man who had slept too little and thought too much. His gaze moved across the benches. He did not stop to greet anyone. He moved toward the center, the seat prepared, and sat. That was the moment, not the first blade, not the first cry. The moment he sat, because to sit meant to lower himself, to become reachable, to become fixed. Kimber approached, politely, holding a scroll, a petition, a brother's pardon. He said. Caesar waved him off. Not today, another day. Kimber stepped closer. Caesar frowned. C-A-C-A stood. Then the world unraveled. No one screamed. Not at first. Caesar twisted in his seat as Casca struck a shallow wound to the neck. A poor blow. Caesar stood, surprised, arms up, voice low and shocked. Casca, what is this? But by then, it had begun. Cassius lunged. Kimber reached. More hands, more blades, not swords, knives, hidden, narrow, meant for this single purpose. The crowd in the room remained seated for a heartbeat too long, watching the impossible take place, watching history, still unsure whether it was theater. Caesar fought back. He moved, not to escape, but to defend. But it was too close, too fast, too many. Then Brutus moved. He stepped forward, not quickly, not dramatically. He simply joined. And Caesar saw. Some say he spoke et2, brute. But those words, if they were spoken, came not in rage. They came in resignation. He stopped resisting. He pulled his toga over his face. He fell, slowly, heavily, at the base of Pompey's statue. Blood on marble, silence in the chamber. Then, The shuffling began, senators fleeing, staff backing away, a few conspirators trembling, Cassius breathing heavily, hands slick, Casca bent at the knees, as if vomiting, Brutus still standing, his blade shaking slightly in his hand. The meeting ended with no conclusion, no new laws passed, no votes recorded, only a man, bleeding, in the city outside, still unaware that everything had changed. Later that night, one of Caesar's aides would quietly collect the documents he had intended to read aloud. Among them, a new legal protection for senators, fearing property seizure. It was never signed. It was never passed. It was folded neatly, stained at one corner, and placed in a chest no one would open for weeks, because Rome, that day, had its final meeting, and the Republic never truly convened again. Asterisk, the night before Julius Caesar died, Calpurnia dreamed in fragments. It came not as one vision, clear and linear, but as a series of broken images, flickering between shadow and fire, echo and silence. She was standing in the forum, alone. There was no sky, just a red haze. Statues wept blood. Men in togas ran past her without faces. And in the center, under Pompey's statue, her husband lay folded in a way no man should be, not resting, not sleeping, collapsed. When she woke, the air in the villa was still, no wind, no birds, just a low creak of timber and the faint sound of a fountain outside. It was still dark. The shape beside her in the bed, Caesar, was still sleeping, though lightly, had never slept deeply since returning from Gaul. But tonight, he looked worn, not peaceful. Just used Calpurnia didn't shake him awake. Not at first. She rose quietly, walked to the edge of the room, and poured herself water with trembling hands. She didn't believe in omens the way priests did, but she also didn't ignore them, not anymore. This wasn't her first warning. Earlier that week, Soothsayer had called out in the street, "Beware the Ides of March." Caesar had laughed it off. Joke, he said. Theater. He even repeated it with a smile to others. But Calpurnia hadn't laughed. She remembered her grandfather, a senator who ignored a dream, then died 2 days later from a simple fall down marble stairs. Rome was not kind to men who mocked fate, so she waited until dawned. Then she told him, not in hysteria, in detail. She described the dream exactly, the colors, the sounds, the blood, statue, the way she felt in it. Not just afraid, but certain. Not a dream, she told him, but a warning wrapped in sleep. Caesar listened. He sat up in bed, rubbed his brow, and said nothing for a moment. He didn't dismiss her, not right away. Instead, he asked for water. He drank slowly, then asked her to tell it again. She did. Every detail, even the absurd ones, the weeping statues, the dripping walls, the shadowed faces. And when she finished, he said nothing again, just sat, thinking. Later that morning, a servant removed the breakfast tray, untouched. The palace was quieter than usual. No couriers had been admitted. No new scrolls delivered. Even Caesar's personal physician had been told to wait in the atrium because Calpurnia had begged him. "Do not go today," she said. "Wait, only today." Her voice was not shrill. It was exhausted, like a woman asking for the smallest favor. A delay. Caesar considered it. Truly, he even told a few aides that he might stay home, and word spread quickly that the great Caesar, the man who never hesitated, was pausing, not because of war, not because of politics, because of a dream. The Senate, hearing the delay, began to murmur. Some expressed worry, others smiled quietly. The conspirators panicked because they needed him there. Not the next day, not next week. That day at the theater of Pompey, in that room, that chair, at that time, Decimus Brutus was sent. He arrived not in armor, not with soldiers, but with poise. He was gentle, respectful, calm. He greeted Calpurnia with warmth. then pulled Caesar aside and spoke softly. Not persuasion, strategy. The Senate waits, he said. They are already gathered. If you do not appear, they will say the Republic bows to a dream. It was not cruelty, it was craft. He didn't insult Calpurnia. He didn't mock her vision. He simply reframed it from caution to cowardice. And Caesar, in that moment, did what he always did. He chose politics, not because he didn't believe her, because he couldn't afford to believe her. He dressed slowly. Calpurnia stood nearby, saying nothing, watching. He wore the red-trimmed toga, simple, ceremonial. He asked for no oils, no perfumes. He left his rings off before stepping into the litter. He turned to her and said, "If I do not return." But he didn't finish the sentence. She didn't ask him to. She simply nodded. Hey, wife who knew too much to argue. A woman who had dreamed the truth, and had it politely filed away by power. The litter left. The city swallowed it, and Calpurnia stood alone in the marble courtyard beneath a pale spring sky, remembering the dream. Every part of it, especially the silence, because in the dream, no one screamed. They only watched like marble statues, bleeding asterisk. When the litter disappeared down the Palatine slope, Calpurnia did not return to bed. She stood for a long while at the edge of the courtyard, barefoot on the cool stone, arms folded over her simple wool robe. Round her, the villa moved slowly. Attendants whispering, sandals tapping against tile, distant pots clinking in the kitchens, but none dared interrupt her. Not because she was commanding, because she looked like marble. She turned once, only once, toward the door where her husband had just passed. Then she walked back inside, not to weep, not to pray, to wait. The hours between dawn and midday in Rome were never quiet. Vendors called, priests sang, slaves shouted commands. The city's rhythm beat without interruption. Inside the house of Caesar, there was a kind of padded stillness. Everything sounded distant, muted, like being underwater. Calpurnia returned to her chamber. She sat, and then, unexpectedly, she began writing. Not to Caesar, to herself, a habit she'd kept since childhood. Letters written and sealed, but never sent. She had dozens, maybe hundreds, stored in a box beneath the cedar chest. She never intended for them to be read. They were vessels, containers for the fear that could not be spoken aloud. Today, the letter was short. She wrote of the dream. Again. This time, in detail, she hadn't shared with Caesar. How the blood had not just flowed from the statues, formed words on the pavement. Latin words, her own name. How the faceless men had not run past her. They had bowed to her and whispered something she could not remember. How she hadn't felt fear, but cold. How the cold had come from Caesar's hand, reaching toward her, but never quite arriving. When she finished writing, she folded the parchment and placed it beneath her pillow. Back in the city, Caesar arrived at the Curia, just as the senators rose. Just as the knives were unsheathed, just as her dream, in every measure, came true. But Calpurnia did not know. Not yet. The hours passed slowly. She did not eat. She did not speak. Around her, the villa remained, paused a place in waiting. Then, just after the sun reached its highest point, noise broke the stillness. Footsteps, running. Voices, low, then rising. Then a servant, pale, breathless, stepped into the atrium. He said no words, only knelt. Calpurnia stood. She did not collapse. She did not cry. She simply said, "Where?" And the boy whispered, "At Pompey's theater, K." It took hours for the body to return. No triumphal procession, no banners, just for slaves, carrying a simple litter, draped hastily with cloth. Entering through the side gate, Calpurnia met them. Halfway, she did not scream. She asked no questions. She merely touched the edge of the cloth with 2 fingers and nodded once, then stepped back. She did not enter the room where he was laid. Not immediately. She went to her writing desk. She removed the letter from beneath the pillow. She read it once, then folded it again. Not burned, not buried. Placed it in the same box as the others. The next day, Mark Antony came. He spoke in low tones, kind, respectful. He asked about arrangements, rituals, wills. He offered soldiers for protection. She thanked him with a nod, but said little else. She was not the widow of a king. She was the keeper of a warning, and no one had listened. Later, when Octavian arrived from the countryside, seeking to claim what had been left to him, he requested a meeting. She agreed. He expected grief. He found silence. She did not try to guide him. She did not lecture or plead. She only said he heard the truth and chose the noise instead. Then she left the room. Years later, after war returned to Rome, and Brutus and Cassius fell, and Antony was undone, and Octavian became Augustus. Someone asked about Calpurnia. She lives quietly, they said, in the hills, near no temples, near no men of law. What does she do all day? She writes, and somewhere on a shelf not far from her bed, there was a wooden box filled with folded parchment, one for every time history decided not to listen to its own dreams. Asterisk after the funeral, Calpurnia vanished, not into shadow, not into exile. She wasn't banished. She didn't flee. She simply stepped sideways into a silence that Rome couldn't follow. Not because she had secrets, but because she had nothing left to say. She attended no public mourning. She gave no speech. She placed no flowers at monuments when the pyre was lit and the people wailed, and Mark Antony lifted Caesar's bloodied robe to the sky. Calpurnia was not there. She remained in the villa, the same villa where she had dreamed, warned, begged, kid, and been ignored. No one questioned her absence, not even Antony, because everyone in Rome understood one truth that no decree had stated. Calpurnia had seen it coming, and she had still been silenced. That gave her a power beyond language. In the days after the Ides, as the city slid into panic and plotting, Calpurnia made a decision. She packed lightly. No entourage, no ceremony. She took her letters, the ones she had written to herself, and a small carved figurine from the household. Shrine dot. Then she left. Not south to the sea, not east to her family estate. She went north, into the hills above the Tiber, into a modest house near the olive groves, a place once used by retired philosophers and aging scribes. It had no guards, no statues, no mosaic floors, just wind and room to write. There, she became a ghost that breathed. People knew where she was. They didn't bother her, danged, because Rome had become too noisy for the sound of one woman's silence. The city turned to other things, to Antony's speeches, to Octavian's rise, to funerals and battles, and the dividing of provinces. The Republic crumbled in earnest now. No one spoke of restoring it anymore. They spoke of order, peace, necessity. Calpurnia, meanwhile, wrote not memoirs, not accusations, observations, pages and pages of them. She wrote about the sound the floor made when Caesar left the villa that final morning, about the look in his eyes when he fastened his toga too tightly, about the taste of the air during her dream, metallic, like breath held too long, about the echo of Decimus Brutus's voice when he assured them both that everything was fine. She wrote these things not to publish them, but to make them real again, because if they stayed inside her, she feared they would rot, and rot, she had learned, always rose quietly, like the scent of forgotten flowers. Visitors came, rarely. A young woman once brought her figs and asked what Caesar was like. Calpurnia replied, tired. Another, a boy training as a priest, asked if the dream had truly been that vivid. Calpurnia said, it wasn't vivid. It was detailed. Then she returned to her writing. She lived through the war, through Philippi, through Antony's fall, through the rise of Octavian, who became Augustus and gave Rome the peace it had demanded from Caesar. Only too late to give it to him. She lived long enough to see statues of her husband rise again, now called divine. People forgot how he died. They remembered how he sounded in stone. And still, Calpurnia wrote, not bitterly, but patiently, as if recording evidence for a trial that would never come. She kept one page sealed in a jar. Only one, it read. I told him, and he chose to go. What greater loyalty is there than to try to stop a man from becoming a god? She died quietly. No monuments, no poems, only a note left on her writing desk. The dream was not the warning. The dismissal was, and beside it, the wooden box, still full, still unopened, still whispering in folds of parchment and unshared thoughts. The sound of what happens when someone listens too late. Asterisk Marcus Junius Brutus was not the kind of man Rome feared. Not at first. He didn't shout in the Senate. He didn't parade in armor. He didn't bribe or seduce or conspire with foreign kings. He wrote essays. He quoted philosophy. He paid his debts on time every time and expected others to do the same. Even Caesar once said, not unkindly, Brutus is the conscience of the Republic. That's why he's always tired. And tired he was, not of duty, but of disappointment. Brutus had watched Rome shift slowly away from what it said it was. He'd seen the promises made in Senate halls dissolve in private gardens. He watched men who once quoted the laws begin quoting Caesar, and he listened too often as ambition disguised itself in the language of stability. He didn't rant about it. He wrote, and when he wasn't writing, was settling accounts. Brutus managed his finances with the care of a librarian. He tracked debts with meticulous precision. If a client owed him 100 sestertii, he'd forgive 30 if the delay was due to drought, but would double the interest if he sensed deception. He was not cruel, but he was exacting. That was his reputation. A man of intellect, of letters, of painful fairness. And that was the problem, because Rome, by 44 BCE, had stopped rewarding fairness. It rewarded certainty, and Caesar was nothing if not certain in the final weeks before the Ides. Brutus found himself walking alone more often. His scrolls went unread. His friends, men like Cassius and Decimus, began stopping by with increasing frequency, not to share bread or ideas, but to talk. And they always began the same way. You know, I trust your judgment. Then came the sentences about duty, about kingship, about legacies. They never said assassination. Not at first. They said action, correction, intervention, words chosen to soften what they were really proposing. And Brutus, he said nothing. He listened, nodded, offered small counterpoints, not because he disagreed, but because that was his habit, to test the structure of a thought before accepting it. But inside, a clock was ticking. He knew Caesar loved him. It wasn't sentimental, it was structural. Caesar admired Brutus the way a sculptor admires a column that never cracks. They had history, shared letters, shared meals, shared battles. Brutus had fought on the side of Pompey once, and Caesar had forgiven him without a lecture. That forgiveness had bound them more than any alliance. But that bond now felt dangerous, because the closer Caesar pulled Brutus into his orbit, the more Brutus began to see the curve of a crown behind his head, not worn, but assumed. The Senate meetings felt different now. Caesar sat while others stood. He dismissed debate with a glance. When Brutus rose to speak, he was acknowledged politely, then ignored. He began to record these moments in his notebook, alongside debts and payments. One page would read, Trebonius, 500 sestertii repaid, 5 days early. Next to it, In smaller script, Caesar dismissed Ligurius's petition mid-sentence. Another page, Cassius owes 120. Reliable, can below it. Caesar wears red sash daily now. He wasn't keeping notes on Caesar's sins. He was building a ledger. The Republic, Brutus believed, was owed something. And if Caesar wouldn't repay it, someone had to collect. But Brutus did not decide in a day. He resisted the planning. He delayed the oaths. He asked for time. Cassius grew frustrated. Cimber stayed quiet. Decimus played patient. But they all knew, without Brutus, there would be no legitimacy, no honor, no justification, only murder. Brutus was the receipt, the signature at the bottom of the decree, and he knew it. That was the cost of his reputation, of always being the one who paid debts on time. So he watched, he measured, he tested his conscience in sleepless nights, and on the evening of March 13th, 2 days before the Ides, he walked alone through the portico of the Temple of Concord. He stood under the torchlight, looked up at the stars, and whispered, perhaps only to himself, if we wait longer, we owe more. He returned home and began writing a final note, not to Caesar, to history. It began with, we act not for hatred, but for harmony. We remove the imbalance. And ended with, let it never be said that I did not calculate the cost. He sealed it. He slept. And when he woke, he looked at the debt ledger on his desk one last time. Everything was balanced. Everything was ready. Asterisk, the morning of the Ides of March. Brutus dressed deliberately, not with flair, not with dread, simply with the routine of a man who lived in the margins between law and philosophy. His toga was folded crisply, the red stripe of senatorial status positioned with care. His sandals were clean. His hands, before leaving the villa, were ink-stained from a note he'd written and left on his desk. He did not pack a blade. He tucked it beneath the fabric. Inside the curve of his belt, hidden from everyone except himself, because Brutus, unlike the others, didn't carry his weapon as a tool. He carried it like a signature as he walked through the city toward the theater of Pompey. His pace was steady, not rushed, not hesitant. To passers-by, he looked like any other senator on his way to a morning session, a man of letters, a man of duty. But inside, something ticked. Not nerves, it's not fear, accounting. Every step measured against every silence Caesar had let pass, every new title he'd accepted, every time the Senate had stood while Caesar sat, every time a proposal was called final without vote, every time a crown was offered and declined only in public, every offense Brutus had logged without fanfare. Now, the balance was due. He arrived at the Senate before Caesar. Inside, the chamber was already beginning to fill. Cassius was there. Cimber, Trebonius, Ligurius, Casca, the usual rotation of names. T's, rearranged today with something harder beneath the smiles. Each man in place, each one careful to appear ordinary. They nodded to Brutus. He nodded back. Nothing was said, because words had already done too much. Brutus sat near the center, the same place he always chose, not out of preference, but out of consistency. He knew that men read meaning into everything. If he moved seats today, someone might notice. And if someone noticed, someone might speak. And if someone spoke, the whole illusion would fall apart. He watched the doors. He watched the light drift through the tall, open windows. He watched Cassius breathe, too, fast. Casca flex his fingers. Cimber touch his sleeve again and again. And when Caesar finally arrived, taller than most, shoulders set, eyes clear but tired, Brutus did not blink. He simply breathed. Caesar entered without his guards. He wore his standard toga, freshly pressed. He was unadorned, no crown, no ceremonial garland, just the scarlet stripe of dictatorship and the weary posture of a man who had been warned that morning again to stay home. He hadn't listened. He smiled faintly to no one in particular. He passed Brutus. Brutus rose, not immediately, but in rhythm with the others, as if it were just another morning, another meeting, another scroll to be read aloud, another vote to be tabled. But no one brought scrolls. There would be no vote, only the final calculation. King Bear approached first. He delivered the petition. Casca moved next, then Cassius. Brutus did not rush. He waited, not because he was unsure, but because the math was not yet complete. Then Caesar turned, met Brutus's eyes. In that instant, nothing was written, but everything was recorded. The debt, the betrayal, the years of letters and debates and shared wine. And Brutus stepped forward. He reached. He struck. The blade found Caesar's lower torso. Not a fatal wound, but it was enough. Enough to make the others believe that Brutus was in. And once Brutus was in, no one hesitated. Steel flashed. Cloth ripped. Sandals scraped. Blood splattered. 20-3 wounds. But history only ever remembers one. The one Caesar didn't resist. The one Brutus gave. And then silence. Not from guilt. From exhaustion. Cassius dropped to his knees. Kimber stood in a daze. Casca turned his face to the wall. Brutus removed the blade and held it at his side, dripping. No one cheered, no one shouted, because Rome was not saved. It had only been balanced. After the body was carried out and the senators fled into the alleys, Brutus remained behind for a moment. He sat down again in the same place. He looked at the floor, then at his hands. He pulled a scroll from his tunic. The note he had written earlier that morning. He unfolded it. Slowly, it read, "No tyrant can die with clean hands, nor can justice be silent forever. I do this, not for revenge, but to prevent debt unpayable." He folded it, left it on the bench, and walked out. No one stopped him. The city hadn't yet understood, but it would, because debts, when unpaid long enough, become history. And Brutus had never left a balance open. The morning after Caesar's death, the sun rose over a Rome that didn't yet know what had happened. Word spread slowly, not because the act was secret, but because the meaning was uncertain. Some believed it was a joke. Some thought Caesar had only been wounded. Others assumed the Senate had expelled him. No one quite imagined that the man who had crossed the Rubicon defied Pompey and restructured the very calendar could fall to knives in daylight among men in clean robes. But Brutus didn't wait for rumors to settle. He walked through the forum just after sunrise, not with guards, not in disguise, just as he was Marcus Junius Brutus, son of a republic that no longer existed, walking among citizens who hadn't yet decided whether to cheer or hide their children. A few senators passed. They nodded. Warily, a few shopkeepers froze in mid-motion, but Brutus did not meet their gaze. He wasn't looking for approval. He was watching the city for movement, any shift, any sign that history had chosen a direction, but Rome had not. Not yet. It was holding its breath. The conspirators reconvened quietly. At first, had expected relief, even gratitude. They imagined the Senate rising as one to applaud. Statues of Caesar would be taken down, that laws he'd enacted would be rolled back, that the Republic would rise like a lion from its stupor. None of that happened. Instead, silence, then fear, then confusion, then rage, because the mob did not see assassins. They saw murderers, and in the marble halls of Rome's memory, where Brutus had hoped his name would echo like that of his ancestor, the one who overthrew the kings, another sound was beginning to grow. "You killed the man who gave us peace." Brutus didn't run. He drafted statements. Calm ones, measured. He met with the Senate. He explained, in exacting terms, that they had removed a tyrant, not a ruler, that Caesar had taken more than the Constitution could bear, that the act had restored balance, not destroyed order. He used the same voice he used in court, but the city was not listening like a jury. It was breathing like a riot. Then came the funeral. Caesar's body laid out in the forum, draped in bloodied robes, burned in full view. Mark Antony gave the speech. It wasn't planned as a call to arms, but it became one. He read Caesar's will aloud. He told the crowd what had been left to them: money, land, peace. He showed them the cloak pierced with blades. He named names: Brutus, Cassius, Trebonius. The crowd changed. It no longer whispered. It roared. Asterisk.